The debriefing chamber smelled like sanitizer and existential dread, which was exactly the sort of detail that would have amused Commander Vex Chen if she hadn't been the reason everyone was having an existential crisis in the first place. Across the pristine metal table, 3 representatives of the coalition sat in varying states of bewilderment. The Catherian delegate, all 4 arms folded in what passed for diplomatic disapproval among his species, kept adjusting his translator with nervous clicks. The Zelani observer, a creature that looked like someone had crossbred a praying mantis with a philosophy professor, maintained perfect stillness except for the occasional twitch of her compound eyes. Between them, the human liaison Dr. Marcus Webb sat with the expression of someone who'd been asked to explain quantum physics to a particularly dim houseplant. "Let me understand this correctly," the Catherian began, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for addressing children and war criminals. "In 18 standard months, you personally orchestrated the complete collapse of 3 galactic superpowers: the hegemony of rational thought, the accumulator syndicate, and the eternal concordat. All of them. God." Chen leaned back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone discussing weekend plans. "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds almost impressive." The Zelani's antennae quivered. "Impressive? Commander Chen, you destabilized a quarter of known space. Billions of beings displaced. Economic systems in free fall. Entire species questioning their fundamental beliefs about reality. And yet," Chen said, examining her fingernails with theatrical disinterest, "here we are. The coalition stronger than ever, trade routes more stable, and fewer people shooting at each other. Funny how that works." Dr. Webb cleared his throat. "Vex, perhaps you could explain your methods to our colleagues. They're having some difficulty understanding how this was even possible." "Oh, I imagine they are." Chen's smile held just enough warmth to be unsettling. "You see, everyone keeps expecting humans to fight like humans. Big ships, bigger guns, tactical brilliance, heroic sacrifices. Very cinematic, very predictable." The Catherian leaned forward. "And you did not." "I fought like them. All of them, sequentially." She gestured vaguely at the air. "The thing about having a species that spent most of its evolutionary history figuring out how to kill everything else on the planet is that you develop a certain versatility. Other species specialize. We generalize. They think like themselves. We think like everyone. That's..." The Zelani paused, compound eyes refracting the harsh chamber lighting. "That's terrifying." "It's effective," Chen corrected. "There's a difference, though I admit the distinction gets blurry sometimes." Dr. Webb pulled up a holographic display, cycling through what looked like psychological profiles mixed with strategic analyses. "The Coalition Tribunal wants to understand the specific methodologies. How did you approach each target?" Chen stood and began pacing, her movement casual but predatory. "You know what the beautiful thing about advanced civilizations is? They're so very advanced, so specialized, so convinced that their way of thinking is not just superior but universal. They can't imagine that someone might understand their psychology better than they do themselves." "Elaborate," the Catherian demanded. "Take the hegemony. Pure logic, emotional suppression, rational decision-making as the highest virtue. They looked at humans and saw chaos, irrationality. They dismissed us as primitives driven by feelings." Chen's grin widened. "So I gave them feelings." The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes either applause or execution. "You gave them feelings," the Zelani repeated slowly. "Among other things, but let's not spoil the surprise." Chen returned to her seat. The point is, I studied them, really studied them. Not their military capabilities or their economic structures, though those were useful too, but how they thought, what they feared, what they couldn't conceive of, what would break them. Dr. Webb scrolled through more data. The psychological profiles you compiled were comprehensive. Obsessive might be more accurate. I spent months learning to think like a hegemony logician, weeks understanding accumulator market psychology, years figuring out how immortal minds process time and meaning. Chen shrugged. It was actually quite educational. You'd be amazed how many ways there are to be intelligent. The Cytherean's forearms shifted uneasily. And the cost. Your report mentions sacrifices. Ah, yes, the famous question. Chen's expression shifted, becoming almost wistful. Sleep friends, and 3 empires, in that order, oddly enough. Sleep? When you're learning to think like 3 different species simultaneously while planning the psychological destruction of entire civilizations, you don't really have time for unconsciousness. Stims help, but they only go so far. Friends? Turns out that becoming an expert in the systematic exploitation of cognitive vulnerabilities makes you somewhat less fun at parties. Who knew? Her laugh held no humor. It's difficult to maintain relationships when you're constantly analyzing how to break the people you care about. The Zerani leaned forward. And the 3 empires? Well, those were the easy part. Chen stood again, this time moving to the chamber's single viewport. Beyond the reinforced transperistyle, the coalition fleet hung in formation against the star field. You see, the thing about destroying civilizations is that it's not actually about the destruction. It's about the rebuilding. The hegemony, the syndicate, the concordat, they weren't obstacles to be removed. They were problems to be solved. Problems? The Cytherean's voice carried dangerous undertones. Irium, systems that had reached stagnation. The hegemony's pure logic was brilliant but sterile. The syndicate's market efficiency was impressive but ultimately self-consuming. The concordat's immortal perspective was valuable but paralyzingly detached from reality. Chen turned back to face the tribunal. They needed change. I just provided the catalyst. Dr. Webb closed the holographic display. Vex, I think what our colleagues are really asking is how. The specific mechanisms, the actual strategies you employed. Oh, that. Chen resumed her seat and folded her hands on the table. Well, since you're all so curious about the details, I suppose I could walk you through it, starting with the hegemony and their fascinating relationship with the concept of rational thought. The 3 coalition representatives exchanged glances, and Chen caught something in their expressions that might have been anticipation or dread. With aliens, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference. But I should warn you, she continued, her smile returning with interest. Once you understand how these things work, you can't unknow them. The techniques I used aren't species-specific. They're psychological universals. They work on anyone intelligent enough to have blind spots. The chamber fell silent, except for the subtle hum of life support systems. Everyone has blind spots, Chen observed conversationally. Even coalition tribunals. Outside the viewport, the fleet continued its stately dance through the void, and somewhere in the depths of the ship, Commander Vex Chen began to explain exactly how someone might go about conquering the known galaxy using nothing more than a thorough understanding of psychology and a complete willingness to sacrifice everything that made life worth living. The Cytherean delegate reached for his translator again, though Chen noticed his hands were shaking slightly. She made a mental note of that detail, along with several others. Old habits after all. died hard. "Picture, if you will," Chen began, settling into her narrative with the comfortable rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this particular horror story. A civilization that had spent 14,000 years perfecting the art of not feeling anything. Dr. Webb activated a new holographic display showing the geometric perfection of hegemony architecture. All clean lines and mathematical precision, like someone had built an empire out of a geometry textbook. The hegemony believed emotion was evolutionary baggage, Chen continued. Chemical reactions that interfered with optimal decision-making. They'd surgically removed their capacity for what they called irrational responses about 6 millennia ago. Fear, love, anger, joy, all gone. They approached every problem with perfect logical analysis. The Zelani's compound eyes focused with uncomfortable intensity. And this was effective for them? Devastatingly so. Their society ran like clockwork. No crime because crime was illogical. No war among themselves because conflict was inefficient. No art because aesthetic appreciation was chemically based and therefore meaningless. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. They were the most successful civilization in their sector precisely because they'd eliminated every variable that might cause unpredictable behavior. So what was their weakness? The Cytherian asked. They had no defenses against chaos. Chen leaned forward conspiratorially. Imagine you've spent your entire evolutionary history in a sterile laboratory, and suddenly someone introduces you to a hurricane. That's what happened when I started broadcasting human cultural materials into their information networks. The Cytherian's translator clicked nervously. What kind of cultural materials? Oh, the usual suspects. Music with emotional crescendos, literature about love triangles and revenge plots, visual art that prioritized feeling over form. But the real breakthrough came when I introduced them to human romantic comedies. The silence stretched long enough for Chen to appreciate the full scope of her audience's bewilderment. Romantic comedies, the Zelani repeated, with the tone of someone trying to decode a particularly cryptic xenoarchaeological artifact. The perfect weapon against pure logic. Think about it. Stories where the optimal solution is always the emotionally satisfying one, where characters make demonstrably irrational choices that somehow lead to happiness, where the entire narrative structure depends on misunderstandings that could be resolved with simple communication. Chen's grin turned predatory. To a hegemony mind it was like trying to solve mathematical proofs, where the answer was always, because love. Dr. Webb brought up population charts showing the hegemony worlds. The effect was rapid. 6 months, Chen confirmed. It started with their information analysts, the ones tasked with understanding these strange human transmissions. They began experiencing what they called cognitive dissonance. The uncomfortable sensation of holding contradictory ideas simultaneously. For species that had never felt discomfort about anything, it was revolutionary. They became curious, the Cytherian said, understanding beginning to dawn in his voice. Worse, they became invested. Hegemony citizens started following human stories like addicts chasing their next fix. They wanted to know whether the couple would get together, whether the hero would succeed, whether the villain would find redemption. They began experiencing suspense, which led to anxiety, which led to relief, which led to joy. The Zelani's antennae twitched. Their government must have intervened. Oh, they tried. Mass media blackouts, mandatory cognitive recalibration, even attempts to surgically remove the neural pathways that were developing these new responses. Chen shook her head with mock sympathy. But here's the thing about emotions. They're not bugs in the system. They're features. Once you activate them, they serve survival functions. Fear keeps you alive. Love builds communities. Even jealousy and anger, properly channeled, motivate self-improvement. Dr. Webb highlighted specific incident reports. The cascade effect was exponential. Citizens who'd experienced emotions didn't want to give them up. They began forming what they called feeling groups, secret societies, dedicated to experiencing the full spectrum of human emotional content. Underground networks sharing banned music, forbidden literature, prohibited films. The government's attempts at suppression only made it more appealing. A revolution based on sensation, the Catharian murmured. The most delicious kind. Within a year, hegemony society had split into two factions. The purists, desperately trying to maintain logical supremacy, and the experientialists, embracing everything their ancestors had rejected. The purists considered the experientialists mentally ill. The experientialists considered the purists emotionally dead. Chen stood and moved to the holographic display, gesturing at the population centers. The breaking point came when someone, and I'll never tell you who, though it wasn't me directly, introduced the concept of humor to a hegemony comedy analysis committee. They had a committee for analyzing comedy? Dr. Webb asked. They had committees for analyzing everything. That was their fundamental approach. Break down all phenomena into logical components and catalog the results. Chen's laugh held genuine appreciation. The comedy committee spent 3 months trying to understand why humans found certain stimulus-response patterns amusing. They developed algorithms, created taxonomies, published peer-reviewed papers on the mathematical structure of punchlines. The Zelani leaned forward, and then one of them got the joke, actually laughed, experienced genuine humor for the first time in 14,000 years of species history. Chen's smile turned wicked. Have you ever seen what happens when someone who's never experienced laughter suddenly finds something hilarious? They can't stop. It becomes a feedback loop, joy feeding on itself, growing stronger with each iteration. The entire committee? The Catharian asked weakly. The entire committee. Then their colleagues, then their families, then their friends. Laughter, it turns out, is even more contagious than yawning. Within weeks, you had hegemony citizens breaking into spontaneous giggling fits during serious governmental proceedings. Their perfectly ordered society descended into what they classified as epidemic frivolity. The chamber fell quiet, except for the distant hum of the ship's engines. The final blow came when I introduced them to the concept of the practical joke, Chen continued. Specifically, the idea that causing minor, harmless confusion in others could be a form of social bonding. A civilization that had operated on perfect information sharing for millennia suddenly discovered pranks. Dr. Webb pulled up the final governmental reports from the hegemony. Their leadership council dissolved itself. They voted unanimously to abandon centralized government in favor of what they called chaotic experiential democracy. Direct translation: they wanted to try everything they'd missed for the past 14,000 years, and they didn't want anyone telling them it was illogical. Chen returned to her seat. Last I heard, they'd established artistic communes, romantic festivals, and competitive emotional expression leagues. And their military? The Catharian asked. Disbanded. Hard to maintain disciplined armed forces when your soldiers keep falling in love with each other, writing poetry about the beauty of distant stars, and organizing musical performances instead of combat drills. The Zelani's compound eyes reflected the chamber lighting like tiny mirrors. You destroyed an empire by making them happy. I liberated an empire by giving them access to the full spectrum of conscious experience, Chen corrected. The destruction was merely a side effect, though I admit the distinction might seem academic from a strategic perspective. She paused. watching their reactions with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read alien expressions as fluently as she read star charts. The beautiful thing about the hegemony operation was its elegance. No weapons fired, no territories invaded, no populations displaced. I simply showed them possibilities they'd never considered, and they chose transformation over stagnation. Dr. Webb closed the holographic display. And the Second Empire? Ah, the Accumulator Syndicate. Chen's expression shifted, taking on the satisfied look of someone remembering a particularly clever chess move. Now that was a different challenge entirely. The hegemony fell to emotions they'd never experienced. The syndicate fell to greed they thought they'd mastered. Outside the viewport, the coalition fleet maintained its precise formation, and somewhere in the depths of space, the remnants of the hegemony of rational thought were probably staging their first annual festival of feelings, complete with competitive crying and synchronized laughter events. Chen made another mental note about the way the Kytherian's hands had stopped shaking. Interesting, very interesting indeed. The Accumulator Syndicate, Chen announced, believed that everything in the universe could be quantified, commodified, and optimized for maximum resource extraction. They were capitalism's final evolutionary form, a species that had literally evolved past the concept of enough. The holographic display shifted to show the syndicate's sprawling trade networks, connecting thousands of worlds in a web of commerce that made interstellar banking look quaint. Their brains had developed specialized organs for calculating profit margins, Dr. Webb added, consulting his notes. They could process market fluctuations across 17 different sectors simultaneously. And they were magnificent at it, Chen acknowledged with genuine admiration. The syndicate had turned resource acquisition into an art form. They could analyze a planet's geological composition from orbit and have extraction contracts drafted before their ships finished landing. Their predictive algorithms could forecast market trends across centuries. The Zelani's compound eyes tracked the trade route displays. So their weakness was, what? Generosity? Chen's laugh was sharp and delighted. Oh, quite the opposite. Their weakness was that they were too good at being greedy. They'd optimized themselves right past the ability to recognize when they were being manipulated by their own desire for profit. The Kytherian's 4 arms moved in what might have been confusion. Explain. I introduced them to concepts they'd never encountered before. Artificial scarcity, speculative bubbles, and my personal favorite, derivatives trading. Chen began tracing patterns in the air, as if drawing invisible market charts. See, the syndicate understood physical resources, minerals, energy, biological materials, things you could weigh and measure and store in warehouses, but they'd never encountered purely conceptual wealth. Dr. Webb brought up financial records showing increasingly frantic trading patterns. The initial contact was through standard diplomatic channels. I posed as a trade representative from a newly discovered human colony world, told them we'd developed revolutionary financial instruments that could generate wealth without requiring physical resources. Chen's grin turned predatory. They were skeptical until I demonstrated how human stock markets could create and destroy value based entirely on collective belief. Collective belief, the Zelani repeated. The idea that something has value simply because everyone agrees it has value. To a species that had spent millennia calculating the exact molecular worth of everything, it was like discovering a new dimension of reality. Chen moved to the display, highlighting specific trade centers. I started small, introduced them to the concept of brand loyalty, paying premium prices for functionally identical products based on reputation and marketing. The Kytherian's translator clicked frantically. And they adopted this? They devoured it. Within months, syndicate corporations were competing not just on efficiency and resource control, but on something they called perception value. They began investing enormous resources in what humans would recognize as advertising and public relations. Chen manipulated the holographic display to show cascading market changes. But the real breakthrough came when I taught them about futures trading, the ability to buy and sell things that didn't exist yet, based on predictions about what might happen. Futures trading exists in many galactic markets, Dr. Webb observed. Not like this. The syndicate took the concept and ran it through their optimization algorithms until they were trading in increasingly abstract derivatives, futures on futures, options on theoretical resource discoveries, complex financial instruments based on projected market psychology that wouldn't mature for decades. The Zelani leaned forward intently. They were gambling. They were innovating, Chen corrected with mock solemnity. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. The beautiful thing about addiction is that the addict always believes they're in control, right up until the moment they realize they're not. The holographic display now showed a bewildering maze of interconnected financial flows, growing increasingly complex over time. The cascade began when I introduced them to the concept of short selling, Chen continued. Betting against your own investments, making money when things fail. The syndicate's profit maximization instincts couldn't resist the mathematical elegance of profiting from both success and failure. Dr. Webb highlighted specific incidents in the timeline. The market volatility became exponential. They started shorting their own companies while simultaneously investing in their competitors who were doing the same thing. Then they began creating synthetic assets, financial instruments that existed purely to be bet against. They were generating phantom wealth and phantom debt in equal measure, convinced they were maximizing efficiency. The Catharian's voice carried a note of horrified fascination. How long did this continue? 18 months of increasingly frantic trading, until they'd created a financial system so complex that no one, not their best analysts, not their most sophisticated algorithms, could actually determine what anyone owned anymore. Chen's expression turned almost fond. They'd turned their entire economy into a giant shell game, and they'd forgotten which shell had the actual resources under it. The collapse was inevitable, the Zelani observed. The collapse was magnificent. Picture, if you will, a species that had spent 10,000 years accumulating real, tangible wealth, suddenly discovering that 97% of their assets existed only as entries in databases that no one could properly audit. Chen returned to her seat with obvious satisfaction. They'd been so busy optimizing their financial instruments that they'd forgotten to maintain their actual resource infrastructure. Dr. Webb brought up the final economic reports. Their leadership's response? Panic, followed by desperate attempts to liquidate imaginary assets to pay for real debts. They tried to collect on contracts for resources that had never existed, from planets that had never been surveyed, using currencies that had been invented purely for speculation. Chen shook her head with mock sympathy. The more frantically they tried to untangle their financial web, the more complex it became. And the human role in this? The Kytherian asked carefully. I may have occasionally provided helpful suggestions about new financial products they might develop, entirely legal, completely above-board consulting services. Chen's innocence was theatrical. They were so eager to optimize their profit streams that they never questioned whether the optimization was actually beneficial. The Zelani's antennae twitched with what might have been admiration. You convinced them to bankrupt themselves. They taught them advanced economic theory, and they chose to implement it without considering the psychological factors that make such systems stable in human societies. Chen gestured at the holographic chaos. Humans developed safeguards against our own financial instruments, regulations, oversight, cultural taboos against excessive speculation. The syndicate had no such protections because they'd never needed them. They trusted their own competence, Dr. Webb added. Fatal mistake. Competence in one area doesn't automatically translate to expertise in another, but they assumed their resource optimization algorithms would work equally well for abstract financial engineering. Chen stood and moved to the viewport again. The final irony was that they had enough real wealth to weather the collapse, but they'd become so psychologically invested in their imaginary assets that they couldn't bring themselves to abandon them. The display showed the final phase. Entire syndicate worlds trading away their mining rights, their agricultural production, their manufacturing capacity, all in desperate attempt to maintain the fiction that their derivative markets represented actual value. They chose financial fantasy over physical reality, the Cytherian said quietly, right up until their creditors came calling and demanded payment in actual resources rather than theoretical instruments. At which point they discovered they'd mortgaged their entire civilization for the privilege of playing with numbers that existed only in their collective imagination. Chen turned back to face the tribunal, noting the way they'd all unconsciously leaned away from her during the explanation. The beautiful thing about the syndicate operation was its self-executing nature. Once I'd introduced the concepts, their own optimization algorithms did all the work. They destroyed themselves, pursuing maximum efficiency, never realizing that the efficiency they were maximizing was entirely imaginary. "And now?" the Zelani asked. "Last I heard, they'd abandoned complex financial systems entirely and returned to simple barter economies. Turns out that after you've lost everything to abstract speculation, the appeal of trading actual goods for other actual goods becomes overwhelming." Dr. Webb closed the economic displays. "Which brings us to the Eternal Concordat." "Ah, yes, the Immortals." Chen's expression grew thoughtful, taking on the look of someone contemplating a particularly elegant chess problem. Now that was the real challenge. How do you defeat beings who have literally infinite time to analyze and counter your strategies? The chamber fell silent except for the steady rhythm of the ship's life support systems, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the former accumulator syndicate was probably conducting its first honest trade negotiations in centuries, carefully exchanging actual goods for other actual goods, while studiously avoiding anything that resembled a derivative instrument. Chen noticed that the Cytherian had begun taking notes, his four hands moving with mechanical precision across his data tablet. Another interesting detail to file away for later consideration. "The Eternal Concordat," Chen began, settling back into her chair with the relaxed posture of someone approaching the climax of a favorite story, had existed for 47,000 years. Individual members lived for millennia, accumulating knowledge and wisdom across centuries of existence. They made decisions on timescales that encompassed the rise and fall of entire star systems. The holographic display transformed into something resembling a vast crystalline structure, nodes of light connected by flowing streams of data that pulsed with hypnotic regularity. Immortality, Dr. Webb noted, consulting his records, achieved through consciousness transfer into quantum substrates. Effective biological death was impossible, and utterly pointless from their perspective, Chen added. When you have infinite time to consider every angle, every possibility, every potential consequence, why would you ever rush into hasty action? The Concordat viewed urgency as a symptom of limited lifespan thinking. The Zelani's compound eyes followed the display patterns. Their government operated on 1,000-year legislative cycles. Of minimum, most decisions took several millennia to finalize, after exhaustive analysis of all variables. Chen traced lazy circles in the air. They'd debate the placement of a single trade station for centuries, considering gravitational effects, cultural implications, economic ripples, and philosophical ramifications across multiple galactic configurations. The Cytherian looked up from his note-taken. Thorough, paralyzingly so. The Concordat was perhaps the most thoughtful civilization in galactic history, and absolutely useless in any situation requiring adaptation to changing circumstances. Chen's smile turned sharp, which made them vulnerable to a very specific type of psychological attack. Dr. Webb manipulated the display to show temporal decision trees branching into fractal complexity. You introduced time pressure. I introduced deadlines. Chen stood and began moving around the chamber with restless energy. Not artificial urgency, but genuine, inescapable temporal constraints tied to physical reality. Things that would happen whether the Concordat finished analyzing them or not. Such as, the Zelani prompted, stellar evolution. Chen gestured at the holographic structure. I provided them with precise astronomical data showing that their primary research facility orbited a star scheduled to go supernova in exactly 43 years, 7 months and 12 days. The chamber's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The star was actually stable, the Cytherian said carefully. The star was perfectly fine, but my calculations were mathematically sound, based on established stellar physics and observable phenomena. The Concordat's own scientists confirmed the projections. Chen's expression grew distant. For the first time in their civilization's history, they faced a problem with a non-negotiable deadline. Dr. Webb highlighted specific communication records. Their response was immediate. Their response was panic masquerading as enhanced analytical focus. Immortal beings who had never experienced genuine urgency suddenly discovered what it felt like to work against time. Chen returned to the viewport, watching the coalition fleet maintain its formations. They began making rapid decisions about evacuation procedures, resource prioritization, personnel assignments, things that would normally take them decades to analyze properly. And they made mistakes, the Zelani observed. Spectacular ones. When you've spent 47,000 years never being wrong because you never make hasty decisions, the experience of being forced into quick choices is psychologically devastating. Chen turned back to face the tribunal, but the real genius was in the follow-up. The holographic display shifted to show cascading alerts and emergency protocols. While they were frantically evacuating their research facility, I provided them with additional astronomical data. 3 more stars in their territory, all scheduled for catastrophic events within the next century. Then 17 more with longer timelines. Then 43 systems showing signs of potential instability. The Cytherian's data tablet clattered to the floor. You convinced them their entire territory was cosmically doomed, Dr. Webb breathed. I provided them with accurate scientific data about natural stellar processes, presented in a format that emphasized temporal urgency rather than statistical probability. Chen's tone remained conversational. Every star will eventually die. Most planets will eventually become uninhabitable. These are physical facts. I simply organized the information to create a sense of comprehensive, inescapable deadline pressure. The Zelani's antennae trembled. They abandoned their worlds. They began what they called proactive temporal resource allocation, systematically evacuating entire systems based on projected timelines for stellar events that might occur anywhere from decades to millions of years in the future. Chen laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Immortal beings, remember. A million-year timeline felt urgent to them. But the evacuations were unnecessary, the Cytherian protested. The evacuations were logical responses to accurate information about inevitable future events. The fact that those events were scheduled for the distant future didn't make them less real, Chen shrugged. I never lied to them. I simply helped them optimize their resource allocation for maximum survival probability across extended temporal horizons. Dr. Webb brought up population movement charts, showing massive migrations across Concordat space. The social disruption must have been enormous. 47,000 years of stable civilization, dismantled in less than 2 decades by their own careful planning, communities that had existed for millennia scattered across the galaxy, cultural centers abandoned, research projects interrupted after centuries of development. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. The psychological impact was the most interesting part. Immortal beings who had never experienced genuine loss suddenly found themselves grieving for abandoned worlds they might never see again. Grief, the Zelani said quietly, and regret, and nostalgia, and all the other emotions associated with irreversible change. The Concordat had avoided such feelings for millennia by never making permanent decisions. Suddenly they were experiencing the full psychological cost of temporal existence. The chamber fell silent except for the steady hum of ventilation systems. But here's where it gets truly beautiful, Chen continued, moving to stand directly in front of the tribunal. The evacuation process itself became self-perpetuating. Once they started making rapid decisions under time pressure, they began noticing how many other problems required urgent attention. Social issues that had been debated for centuries suddenly seemed critical. Resource conflicts that had been analyzed for millennia demanded immediate resolution. Dr. Webb scrolled through final reports. They dissolved their government? Added. They restructured into what they called temporal response cells, small groups empowered to make immediate decisions about localized problems without waiting for collective analysis. Chen's smile returned. Within 5 years, the Eternal Concordat had effectively transformed into thousands of independent communities, each operating on normal biological timescales rather than immortal ones. You gave them mortality, the Cytherian said, understanding dawning in his voice. I gave them the experience of living in time rather than simply existing through it. The psychological transformation from immortal detachment to temporal engagement. Chen clasped her hands behind her back. They're still immortal technically, but they think and act like mortal beings, making decisions based on immediate priorities rather than infinite analysis. The Zelani leaned forward intently. And this brings us to your true confession, the real cost of these victories. Ah, yes. Sleep, friends. And 3 empires. Chen's expression grew distant. 18 months of total immersion in alien psychology. Learning to think like 3 completely different species simultaneously, while maintaining enough human perspective to exploit their cognitive blind spots. The sleep deprivation was physical, Dr. Webb observed. Stimulants and neural enhancers can only carry you so far before the biological substrate starts breaking down. I spent the final 6 months in a state that was barely consciousness, running on chemical focus and stubborn determination. The friends? The Cytherian asked. Try explaining to people you care about that you're spending every waking moment figuring out how to psychologically destroy entire civilizations. Even with the best intentions, even for the greater good, it changes how you interact with everyone around you. Chen's laugh held no humor. When you become expert at manipulating minds, people stop feeling comfortable around you. They start wondering what you're really thinking, what you're really planning, whether you're analyzing their weaknesses even in casual conversation. And you were, the Zelani stated. Old habits die hard. Once you learn to see psychological vulnerabilities, you can't unsee them. Every conversation becomes a tactical assessment. Every relationship becomes a potential strategic asset. Chen moved to the center of the chamber. But the three empires, that was the easy part. The silence stretched until Dr. Webb finally broke it. Easy. Destroying civilizations is simple once you understand their psychology. Building something better in their place, creating stable transitions that minimize suffering, ensuring that the chaos serves constructive purposes. That's the real work. Chen began walking a slow circle around the tribunal. The hegemony needed to experience emotion. The syndicate needed to confront the difference between real and imaginary wealth. The Concordat needed to learn temporal thinking. I didn't destroy them, I helped them evolve. Evolution through psychological warfare, the Cytherian said carefully. Evolution through expanded consciousness. Each civilization was trapped by the limitations of their own worldview. I simply provided them with perspectives they couldn't reach on their own. Chen completed her circle and stopped directly in front of the tribunal table. Which brings us to the interesting question of why this tribunal exists at all. The chamber's environmental system seemed to pause mid-cycle. You see, Chen continued conversationally, the coalition has been remarkably successful since the collapse of those three empires. Trade routes stabilized, territorial disputes resolved, unprecedented cooperation between species that had been hostile for centuries. One might wonder why you'd want to interrogate the architect of such beneficial outcomes. Dr. Webb's expression grew guarded. The coalition leadership wants to understand your methods. The coalition leadership wants to understand whether I represent a threat to their own psychological stability. Chen's smile returned predatory and knowing, which is a perfectly reasonable concern given the circumstance. The Zelani's compound eyes tracked Chen's movements with mechanical precision. Are you? Depend entirely on whether the coalition suffers from the same fundamental weakness as the other three empires. Chen resumed her seat, folding her hands on the table with theatrical casualness. Psychological blind spots, cognitive limitations that prevent adaptation to changing circumstances, institutional rigidity masquerading as stability. The Cytherian's four hands had begun trembling again. And do we? Dr. Webb asked. Chen's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were considering the question for the first time, rather than planning this moment for months. Well, she said finally, that remains to be seen. But I do find it fascinating that a tribunal convened to investigate my methods has spent the last several hours learning exactly how those methods work, step by step, technique by technique. The chamber fell completely silent, except for the sound of three alien nervous systems processing the implications of that observation. After all, Chen continued with gentle amusement, what better way to understand how someone destroys empires than to have them explain their techniques in exhaustive detail to representatives of the next potential target? Outside the viewport, the coalition fleet maintained its precise formations, and somewhere in the depths of space, the fragments of three fallen empires were busy building something new from the ruins of their former certainties. Chen made one final mental note about the way the tribunal members were looking at each other and settled back to wait for their next question. Some conversations, she reflected, were worth having twice.